What would you give if you could know the future? That's next on the Prophetic Connection. This place, the Mount of Olives, very near. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when the Messiah will come. You know, the future is described for us in the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a parallel book to the book of Revelation. Revelation was written nearly 2,000 years ago, but Daniel was written 500 years before that. Now, people today in the 21st century, some of them at least, would dismiss Daniel as the ravings of a madman because of the things he describes in his book, the dreams and the visions that he saw or others saw and he interpreted. But when we think of Daniel, it's important to remember what Jesus said about Daniel. 500 years after Daniel lived, Jesus lived, and yet he said this about Daniel. It's found in Matthew 24 in verse 15. And this is in the context of the answer he gave his disciples about signs at the end of days and the signs that would point to his coming. Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus said, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place," and we believe that this is an image the Antichrist figure will raise up in the temple in Jerusalem. And there is no temple in Jerusalem today, but we can interpret from this verse that there will be a temple built again in the holy city. And then Jesus says, "Whoever reads, let him understand." Because many will read and will not understand. Many will dismiss Daniel altogether. But the wise will understand that Daniel truly was a prophet, and the things that he had to say were revealed to him by the Almighty God.
As Daniel continued to walk with God, he began to have dreams and visions about the future. However, he was troubled and confused by his first vision when he saw 4 great beasts rising up out of the sea. As Daniel struggled to understand the vision's meaning, a mysterious figure appeared and explained to Daniel that the 4 beasts he saw represented, in order, 4 kings or empires to come, and that each of these kingdoms in turn would conquer and supplant the one that preceded it.
God seems to enjoy, or at least have a pattern of revealing the future to Daniel and to other servants. I'm remembering a passage of Scripture that says God reveals to his servants what will come to pass. So later in the book of Daniel, we have more visions where Daniel is told by God or shown by God what will come in the future. I think that's God's nature.
In his vision, Daniel saw 4 beasts, but the 4th beast he described as the worst of the 4, a beast that was dreadful, terrible, and exceedingly strong.
Not only from a chronological perspective, but from the Jewish interpretation of the story, that last empire is Rome. If you look at Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome is the last one. Rome is, in many ways, considered to be the worst one. I mean, it's the Roman Empire that will destroy the Second Temple. It's the Roman Empire that will exile the Jewish people, not for 70 years like Babylon, but for 2,000 years. And in Jewish thinking, Rome, which Jewish tradition says comes from Esau, Jacob's twin brother, is in many ways always viewed as the greatest threat to the Jewish people. Shows that that beast represents is an accurate portrayal of what's going to be in terms of the damage and the threat that the Roman Empire has posed towards the Jewish people. Even the anti-Semitism of Europe that came hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, is the anti-Semitism of Esau, which is Western civilization, which comes from Rome.
God allowed Daniel to see the near future and events that would occur during his lifetime. But God also allowed Daniel to see the very distant future, a series of incredible events that would occur at the end of days and lead to the culmination of human history.
The visions that Daniel have double meanings, meaning for his time and meanings for the end of times as well. And to understand this, we need to get away from our Western sequential, logical thinking and understand that these revelations are coming out of the Middle East. This is Eastern thinking. It's more circular. And so it's not illogical for Daniel to have visions that would have application for his time, but also in parallel for the end of times.
While Daniel was clearly a prophet for his own times, the deep things God revealed to him tell us he was also a prophet for all time. We know this because Jesus quoted directly from the book of Daniel when he spoke about events on earth that would point to the nearness of his second coming, things Daniel had already seen and written about 500 years earlier. Don't go away. After this short break, Dr. John Tweedy returns with his teaching.
When we come to Daniel chapter 7, we have a dilemma. And it's this, that the chapter opens with a reference to Belshazzar, king of Babylon. In fact, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and vision of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Now, we're in chapter 7, but we know that Belshazzar died at the end of chapter 5. In fact, in the last two verses, it explains the transition of kingdoms when Belshazzar dies, and then Darius the Mede assumes control, he being the age of 62. So how do we resolve this dilemma? Well, it's simply this, that chapters 7 and 8 of Daniel properly belong between chapters 4 and 5. And that's how we resolve this dilemma. And why is it this way then? Well, the first 6 chapters are arranged because of their historical events, whereas the last 6 chapters cover visions and dreams that Daniel had. And they're prophetic, more prophetic in nature, in fact, than the first 6 chapters. So the chapters have been arranged this way, so we just need to understand that if we're doing this chronologically, then these 2 chapters and the 2 visions that are in them, the visions that Daniel had, belong actually before chapter 5, which records the death of Belshazzar. And so Daniel has a vision, and he describes it like this in verse 4. See, he sees creatures. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. Now let me give you the interpretation as we go along, because we can easily get lost in the translation here. The first beast was like a lion, and of course lions were used in Babylon. They were symbols of Babylon, especially with eagle's wings. And so we believe this to be the Babylonian kingdom. But then there's a second beast, which is really pointing to the coming of the Medo-Persian Empire. And it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. This signifies the power of Persia over the power of the Medes. In other words, Persia was the stronger of the 2, even though they formed a military alliance. Verse 6, and after this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, we interpret this to mean the kingdom of Alexander the Great, who at the age of 20 assumed the kingdom of Greece, actually Macedon, which is the northern part of Greece, after his father, and Alexander assumed command of the army. And it moves like a leopard because Alexander conquered much of the known world in a matter of 12 years, and he died prematurely at the age of 32. So Daniel in this vision is seeing the prophetic future, the rise and fall of empires in succession. Now we come to verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible. exceedingly strong. Now, he doesn't identify it with any animal that we would know. It's, if you like, a nondescript beast. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, here's the bit of a shift, because this fourth nondescript beast represents the Empire of Rome. And so Rome, of course, came and conquered the Middle East after the Greeks conquered the Holy Land. But the Romans were particularly cruel to the people of Israel. I mean, the other empires had their influence on the people of Israel, but none of them really, well, the Babylonians certainly destroyed the first temple, but when the Romans came, they destroyed the second temple. And worse than that, they forced the people of Israel out of the land of Israel. They dispersed them into the world. And Jewish people today talk about the diaspora, or the dispersion of the Jewish people from the land. The Romans wanted to wipe out every vestige of Jewish history and presence in this promised land. Now, there's a shift that occurs, and it's this. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little horn, coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and therein is this first horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Now, we remember that the fourth nondescript beast had 10 horns, but now there's one of these horns is distinguished in particular. It's a little horn, but it's a little horn with great power. Now, when we read this verse, we can be interpreting history soon after Daniel wrote the words, and certainly the coming of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Greek general who desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. He could be seen as the little horn. But I believe it's also pointing forward. Perhaps he is a type of Antichrist, but this verse also points forward. And this is why sometimes prophetic scriptures are difficult to understand, because they can be speaking of more than one period of history. And so this is clearly identified as a man who speaks pompous words. Now, we have seen in other places, and certainly in other series of the prophetic connection, we've learned much about the Antichrist figure. And I won't take the time to go there, but Revelation 13 describes this figure who is to come. At the very end of the Bible, the last book of the New Testament, we have the description of the Antichrist figure. And of course, Jesus alludes to him in the sense that there will be a time of great tribulation when this individual rules, but does so under the power of Satan. Well, now there's a shift again in the scriptures, and in verse 9, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. And the Ancient of Days can only be God the Father, God Almighty, the ruler of the whole world. And the description is here. And actually, this is a reminiscent of Revelation chapter 20 and the great white throne judgment, where God Almighty sits in judgment of individuals. But listen to the description. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. And Daniel is describing what he sees. A fiery stream issued and came forth before him. 1,000,000 ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. That is a very strong parallel to the great white throne judgment of Revelation 20, actually the end of that chapter. And then we see this. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. So now this horn is placed, if you like, in the same context as the Ancient of Days. And if it is the great white throne judgment, we realize these are the end of days that are being addressed here. I watched till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. Now, I'll give you a very specific reference, parallel reference that we find in the book of Revelation in chapter 19. And of course, this comes at the very end of the Battle of Armageddon that takes place in Revelation 19. But listen to the parallels and the similarities between what I just read in Daniel and what I'm going to read here. Verse 20, then the beast was captured, That's another word for the Antichrist. And with him the false prophet, who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword, which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. And the individual sitting on the horse is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That is the Christ who is to come. So now let me reread verse 11 of Daniel 7. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn, the Antichrist, was speaking. I watched till the beast, now we have the same parallel language, the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. There's a very strong parallel between what I just read in Daniel and what I read a minute ago in the book of Revelation. Now, as we continue on, verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. Now we have another shift. Now the focus is on the Messiah who is to come. He came to the Ancient of Days. They brought him near before him. Then to him. Now in my Bible, the pronoun him has a capital H, which suggests that this is the Messiah figure. And the description is clear that it's the Messiah figure. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Now, it's interesting. I'm standing south of Jerusalem, and I'm standing among ruins. And the ruins that you find in Israel, I mean, these ruins are 1st and 2nd century before Christ. And in fact, they're probably earlier still, because I believe there was a palace that stood here as well. But wherever you go in the land, in fact, wherever you go in the Middle East, you're going to come across ruins that are 2,000, 3,000 or more years old. And that's because of the empires that have risen up, have conquered and destroyed. But the difference here in this text is this final kingdom of the Messiah will never be destroyed, because it is an eternal kingdom. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar confessed that earlier. We saw that earlier in the teachings in the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel sees all this, and he says in verse 15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts, which are four kings which will arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. The eternal kingdom of Christ. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and another horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. And then I'm jumping to verse 24. The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. So what we're being told is that there'll be a revived, I believe, a revived Roman Empire made up of nations, and it will shift, and one will rise to prominence, but one will be the kingdom of the Antichrist. And in verse 25, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hands for a time, times, and a half a time. Time, times, and a half a time. 3.5 years. We're back to the Great Tribulation theme that Jesus had so much to say about. And then we're told at the very end of the chapter, the court will be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, the dominion of the Antichrist, to consume destroy it forever. And then the everlasting kingdom shall be ushered in. It ends with this. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed. But I kept the matter in my heart. But we're left with the question, who is this Antichrist figure, and could he be in the world today?
Don't go away. There's more from Dr. John Tweedy after this short break.
When we try to determine the identity of the little horn of Daniel 7, verse 8, we interpret this to be a symbol of the Antichrist figure who is to come. We have strong parallels in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. And in fact, although the books of Daniel and Revelation are some 600 years apart, scholars look at both books as being intertwined. In fact, the same themes, some of the same themes run through Daniel that are also found in Revelation. I'll give you a parallel when we speak about the Antichrist figure. We know, for example, in Daniel 7, in verse 8, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. These seem to be, the horns represent nations, but one of them is more powerful than the others. And in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So now we're not simply talking about nations, but an individual within the nations, in fact, a ruler of one nation, that puts in subjection the other 3, and then, in fact, ends up having worldwide influence. But when we get to the book of Revelation, notice this parallel in the visions that John the Apostle saw. Revelation 13, verse 1. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, perhaps the sea of humanity in this sense, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And here we have the horns reference that we just saw in Daniel chapter 7. And on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name, because this is the characteristic, one of them at least, of the Antichrist figure. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon, a synonym, another name for Satan, gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So Satan is empowering this evil individual to do his bidding. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. You can imagine if someone today was, say, an attempted assassination. In fact, if the wound was mortal, he was in fact killed and was resurrected, the world would be in awe of that individual. Well, the Antichrist is going to be empowered by Satan, so he's going to have unusual demonic powers and a demonic presence. And because of it, we read in Revelation, so they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who was able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Remember, 3.5 years. In fact, to the end of the Great Tribulation period, which is really, we believe, 7 years long, but the second 3.5 years are far worse than the first 3.5. So he's allowed to continue until that is over. And then it says in verse 7, it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. Now, we have studied the Antichrist a lot in various seasons of the prophetic connection. So I'm going to read something that you've been made aware of before in other seasons about his economic system that he will introduce that will make it difficult for those who follow God to buy and sell, in fact, function. Verse 16 of Revelation 13. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, I emphasize man. His number is 666. So here we have a direct parallel between Revelation and Daniel, speaking of horns, and one in particular that we believe will be the Antichrist figure. In the next episode, we're going to look at two mysterious creatures, a ram and a goat.
Thanks for watching The Prophetic Connection, and join us next week for The Ram and the He-Goat.